That was sung by Eleanor. You can check out that music at Rooftop Revolutionaries. I think wherever you get music. And welcome to our show. This is Silver Threads, still walking, still waking. And I'm Carla Bergman.
Thank you, Carla, for the shout out. Yes, you can get that music on iTunes and Spotify. Yes, and I am Eleanor Goldfield, and this is the show where we trace our present path through the people and stories of the past, as we ourselves, long-term radicals, learn about each other, from each other, and continue to walk, continue to wake. This week, we're joined by Natacia Knapper. 37 years old, Natacia is an organizer with Stop Police Terror Project DC, formerly DC Ferguson, and Ward 1 Mutual Aid as part of the DC Mutual Aid Network. Originally from San Diego, she has lived in the DC metropolitan area off and on since the late 90s and has been a part of the DC movement for Black Lives since 2017. In addition to extensive travel throughout the States, Europe, and parts of Asia, Natacia has lived in many places, including Boston, New York, Dublin, and New Mexico, but landed in DC as her home base. The daughter of a Black immigrant and also of a Black parent raised in the Deep South, she was brought up grounded in all of the ways the state intentionally oppresses her people. Through her own experiences as a Black woman fighting for liberation in a country that devalues her existence, and growing up hearing about the powerful journeys of those who came before her, she realized early on the power of storytelling and long-form dialogues. As a graduate of journalism and literature, she also carries the stories and words of James Baldwin, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and Assata Shakur, revolutionaries that have carried her through the arduous, though beautiful, work of freedom fighting and community building. Welcome to the show, Natacia.
Thanks for being on our show. I don't know if Eleanor told you, but our original goal for this show was to meet people in person and video and go on walks with you, like literally, keep walking, keep talking. So we're going to metaphorically go on a little walk with you, and hopefully you're excited to tell us a little bit about your story and maybe some of the watershed moments that got you involved in organizing, in mutual aid and anti-Blackness and all the stuff you're doing.
Great. Yeah. I'm just really honored to be here. Really excited to engage in any sort of storytelling project because I just think that they're really powerful and important. So yeah, I'm very glad that y'all have welcomed me into your space.
Thank you for being here. And and for listeners, that is the sound of slumlords and above my apartment. That's what they sound like. They're kind of like rabid beetles. Like that's kind of what that sounds like to me. So the first thing that we'd like to ask folks is to kind of highlight like a couple of watershed moments, like a time when your thinking was really profoundly shifted, or you were inspired to act or get involved with collectives or movements.
Yeah, sure. I feel like there's just so many moments that I could pick out. I think the two big ones, and we'll see if I can come up with a third one, but the two big ones I can think of are when I was in college. I went to college in Boston, Emerson, which, I loved going there, but it's very kind of like artsy fartsy, liberal school environment. And I think a lot of the classes that I took were very centered on the sort of stories and the sort of history that really kind of works to like uplift problematic hierarchies and, all the typical things that you get in like college and school environments. But one class I took in particular was an African-American lit class. And we read all of the typical books that you would imagine that you would read in a class like that. I don't really need to go down the like whole list. But one book that was provided to me by my professor was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And I don't think any other book has like fundamentally like changed me the way that book did. I think it awakened a lot of thoughts on how we put ourselves into boxes, and how freeing it is to kind of accept ourselves, whether it's like through our queerness, through our other identities that we which may feel marginalized, even though I hate that word, or we have trouble kind of connecting with that identity. Something about the way that book was written really helped me sort of like understand like my own like queer story. So that was like really important for me. But also it was written in such a like deeply personal way, and it helped me kind of go down the rabbit hole of like, all right, so I kind of knew who James Baldwin was a bit, but like maybe I should really look into this guy a little bit more. And his writing has I cannot convey like how much like my entire organizing and sort of like social engagement is so centered on a lot of his teaching. So that introduction into James Baldwin really shifted a lot of my thinking. I think I could talk more about James Baldwin, and I will, but the other thing for me was when I've lived off and on in DC since like the late 90s, or late 90s, early aughts. And, but I started living in DC properly back in 2007 or 2008, something like that. After my time with AmeriCorps, which, you know, we can explore that if we want to later on. I have some stories, but I came back to the DC area and lived in DC proper. Went to American University, got a degree in journalism, master's, and that was all great. But I was really struggling in how to actually do real movement work. So I volunteered with a couple of like groups here and there. Nothing was really sticking. And, you know, after everything that happened in Ferguson, I think that really changed a lot of people's perspectives. And, or I wouldn't even say change people's perspectives. I feel like it created an urgency in the air, in that these were things that like, we can't hide from this anymore. So I started trying to be a little bit more active in the movement space happening in DC that was like growing. And in 2016, and, you know, not really going to go into that whole, you know, nonsense that happened at the end of that year. But in 2016 was kind of a moment in which I started realizing America just is not understanding where we are at right now. And I really wanted to really address a lot of the kind of like really like local focus systemic issues that are happening. A lot of volunteer spaces I was like in were just focused on sort of like the national like M4BL, like movement for Black Lives stuff. And I really wanted to be like hyper locally focused. And so I went to a teach-in that was done by the DC Movement for Black Lives. And through that really incredible meeting, I got connected to a gentleman by the name of Eugene Prieur. And he really was the person who introduced me to Stop Police Terror Project, which is like one of my 2 movement homes right now. And having that conversation with Eugene, and like hearing the word really like terror, like as like a descriptor for like how police have been engaging with like our communities, and like the sense of dread it really like creates like inside of the Black community. The way that he articulated that spoke to something in me I didn't even realize was there. And like, he was really able to put words to things like I wasn't even like ready for. And yeah, it was just like those two moments like are, I think, two of the most pivotal moments I've had in terms of like my organizing.
Shout out to Eugene.
Yes, always.
Yeah, I love that it's like it's connected to people, and it sounds like storytelling is part of the watershed moments too, of like reading and hearing other people's stories. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this show is we were trying to have a public conversation about how challenging it is to grow and learn in movement spaces and in collectives, particularly maybe, as a cross-pollination conversation for newer organizers, to hear that it's not always easy and we all struggle. So we ask our guests to perhaps tell us some of your maybe facepalm moments or some of your learning moments that, might feel a bit vulnerable, but like, you came out on the other side and you're all good.
Yeah. I think one that really like, comes to my mind actually involves somebody that Eleanor knows, Bo, Uncle Bo Luther. So I had just started with Stop Police Terror Project, and this was in 2017. One of the first projects that I had, we had been focused up until that point, sort of in mid 2017, on the passage and full funding of like the NEAR Act. That level of organizing and advocacy taught me a lot of do's and don'ts and things that I really learned a lot from. But I actually kind of want to focus on Juneteenth. So one of the first things that I kind of took ownership with and had like a lot of passion around was wanting to celebrate Juneteenth in DC, and I'm from Southern California, but my dad's family is all from Louisiana and Texas, and Juneteenth is a big deal, like in my dad's family. I like grew up like celebrating Juneteenth every year, and it was like a big deal. And I just was noticing outside of like one or two organizing spaces, and kind of like on a small scale, there just didn't seem to be like a huge acknowledgement in DC on like the importance and history of Juneteenth. So because, DC just has such a huge, it's just so huge, like in Black culture, it's like, it just kind of broke my heart a little bit that like there just wasn't more of a focus on this holiday. So I kind of, not just alone, obviously, but with like so many amazing comrades that I met through Stop Police Terror Project and other folks in the movement for Black Lives, put together this like really incredible lineup of like a week of like actions and, activities and all these like beautiful like offerings to like the community on just kind of educating people, but like also just like celebrating. Because one of the big things that I love about Juneteenth is it's not just about like centering on trauma. It's like about celebrating how amazing it is to be Black in America and like the resilience that we have. And I really wanted to bring that to the space. That's all to say, I kind of decided that like a really great place to have this event was in Ward 7, this big, beautiful park. And I, did a little bit of outreach, right? Like, did some door knocking to let neighbors know that we were going to be there. And, that's actually how I originally met Bo. Bo was gardening, like, of course, like when I was just like walking through his old neighborhood and we just clicked immediately. We're just chatting about stuff. And I was just like very excited about like telling him about Juneteenth, and he was excited to be there. But I think in doing this really, what I felt like is robust outreach, I didn't really like include a way for the community to participate. Like I was just like, oh, we are going to come in and like, bring this food and just like, we have all this tabling set up already. And like, there just wasn't any real community collaboration, and Bo was very, I think he was a lot more patient with me than I think I really deserved. But like, it's something that I really had to learn about, because like it stung, like kind of hearing from him that like, hey, it's actually not great that you sort of came here and didn't really engage with the community in a deeper way. We'd been planning this event for like 2 months. Like, why didn't I like actually do like outreach from the very beginning? I don't live in Ward 7. That's like not my community. So that was something I really learned from, and it really stayed with me. And it's what leads me in a lot of my organizing work, like being responsive to the community and not just having the community be responsive to like what I want to do.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. And I think that's also like a beautiful facepalm moment, because it's a moment where somebody was willing and able to take you to the side and be like, hey, you're really awesome, but this wasn't great. As opposed to like, fuck you, you fucked up, we don't want to talk to you anymore. which can like which some people have experienced in movement spaces for sure, and like how powerful it is to be called in as opposed to called out.
Mm-hmm.
So another part of this, I'd be also be interested to hear, like, because you've lived in a lot of different places. I'm curious what radicalism means to you, and also like how that ties to a space like geographically, and if that shifts with geographic space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. So some of the places I've lived in New York, I lived in Boston. I'm from California originally. I've never lived in Louisiana, but I've spent like enough time where I kind of feel like it's another little home of mine. So, I mean, the organizing in all of those different spaces are so completely different, and just like really understanding what it means to sort of, again, kind of to what I was just saying, being answerable to and led by people who've been like really like leading this work in a lot of these spaces. I think in Boston, which was like an interesting city to live in for a lot of reasons. A lot of the work, a lot of the organizing I was connected to was a lot of sort of kind of organizing that was like led by some like radical sort of for lack of a better way of saying this, like Irish groups, where a lot of like Irish working class like groups. And I feel like I actually learned a lot and found like a lot of really awesome comrades like through that space. But there was like a lot of work and unpacking that needed to be done around anti-Blackness and things like that. And I think like when we talk about anti-Blackness, I think a through line that is really important in all of the spaces is making sure that you're doing the work through a lens of not just class, because class is so important. And like, I think that like, it is like one of those things that like people are talking about in a more pronounced way than I've really ever seen people talk about. And I'm very excited about that. But if you're not really talking about class through the lens of race, I really feel like you're kind of doing a disservice to that work. And I think like that applies to like organizing and kind of relationship building in all of the spaces that you're in. Like if there isn't a lens of race that you're approaching the work through, you are going to like the work that you're doing is going to be incredibly short-sighted. And at the end of the day, you're going to leave out like folks who are like the most like impacted and harmed, by the work that we're, by the things we're trying to prevent, right? By the things that we're trying to fix, by the things we're trying to dismantle. And that lens of race looks incredibly different depending on like where you're living. When I lived in New York, like, man, like the kind of like way of like working around sort of like the Latinx community and like the Black community and like, we can kind of go into like more like deeper into like the different kind of groups. But with those two in particular, at least in like the neighborhood I lived in, there was just like a lot of beef like between like those two communities. And then like just like a lot of kind of like just like realizing how important the actual like intersections of like those like racial communities like also like how those like turn up. And those are things that I really am always continuing to learn about, to be honest. And even like as recently as like last year, I, was realizing there were still things that I needed to unpack in how like I think of the Latinx community versus the Black community and putting those in separate boxes. So yeah, it looks very different, but I think regardless of where you're organizing and where you're building relationships in neighborhoods, making sure you are doing that through like a racial lens is like critical, I think.
Yep. Yeah. Intersectionality all the way. That's so important. And thanks for sharing your vulnerability around your learning too. I wanted to go back and pull a thread that you just said really quickly. I'm super curious your thoughts on marginalized. You said you didn't really like it. I feel like there's a weaving that can happen. What you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's kind of like my reasoning is pretty simple. It's not like super complex around like why I'm not really a huge fan of that word. I just think it's very othering, to be honest. I think it really puts people again, other than being othered, it's sort of I don't know. It does something, it devalues that group's power or something. Like there's something about that word that just like really like gets under my skin because it feels like it's saying something about like people's I don't even know if like there's some connection to how it's not exactly infantilizing. That's not exactly the word I'm looking for, but it really does kind of, it feels like it strips away like a person's like power. And I still haven't quite figured out like, what's the alternative like word that I want to use that kind of gets at what I'm trying to say when like people like use the word marginalized. But yeah, and I know like a lot of like comrades I love and respect that like still use that word, and like I get like what people are trying to say when they use it. But yeah, it just feels very depowering in a way that like I just not a fan of. Let's build power. That's what I would like to like.
Yeah. I really like that. I always like to use marginalization kind of inverted, like the radical sectarian white anarchists who marginalize their project down to like 5 people who look and act, and that to me is marginalized.
Yeah.
So I really love. That's why I was like, "Ooh, I'm interested in what you have to say." And, yeah, and it's connected to kind of like the hierarchy that sort of lurks around in our relationships, and really at this the problem with all of it is like that whiteness, that white supremacy, and like when you're looking through the lenses of the different oppressions, like we're so taught that there's something has to be supreme, something has to be at the center or at the top, the hierarchy or whatever, and I think that's what we're up against often. So it's good to look at the other side, which is that word marginalized, and unpack it a bit. I really appreciate that. I think it connects to our question about scaling over, but I'm going to let Eleanor talk about it because I always muck it up.
I don't think you muck it up at all. And I think mucking it up is part of the fun, right? It's like, it's like the word marginalized. Like, I don't know what to put there, but that's not what you put there. And it also speaks to like how language shapes our understanding of things, and how, when we don't have the word for something, it ends up falling into a category that it shouldn't exist in. So one of the questions that we've asked folks recently, because this was actually a suggested question by one of our guests, was, in these times, whether that be like specifically the COVID crisis that lays on top of the capitalism crisis, or if it's like larger, why haven't we scaled over? Why hasn't our power risen above the upper echelons of our society, like our oppressors? And is it because we're afraid of our capacity for power? Is it like a problem of infighting, or basically just kind of that silver bullet question, like why?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's like a really powerful question. I think it's a lot of things. To be honest, it has been really like heartening to see like how people have been moved to have like more difficult conversations and really be doing the work in a more, bringing more of themselves into like shifting things. And